So we've talked about you and Mom, Anne, getting married. Now we want to talk a little bit about Mom's family and where she came from.
That's very interesting. Her family, we can go back to her great-grandfather, a gentleman by the name of Jacob Behlzar, who was a Bagdadi merchant. In those days, Baghdad was part of the Ottoman Empire. Jacob met a woman named Ester, who was from Salonika. Salonika at that time was probably part of Macedonia. But the fact that her name was Ester and she came from Salonika sort of tags her as with Spanish Jewish roots, and probably her family generations earlier had fled the Spanish Inquisition in 1492. I think we know that because Anne mentioned that her grandmother knew some Ladino, and Ladino was a kind of hybrid language between Hebrew and Spanish. We also know that she would have been Sephardic. Sephard means Spain. So Esther and Jacob are married. They have two daughters, Serena and Rosina. And when the daughters are preteen, maybe 8 or 9 years old, and I don't recall which one was older or younger, but when they were both preteen, Ester, the mother, dies. And now you've got a situation of this, Baghdad merchant who's traveling around. How does he go about raising two children, preteens? So basically you give them away. He gets on a boat, and this one probably would have been around 1850 or so. And he knew a woman, Marion, who lived in either Bombay or Calcutta and who didn't have any children. So he takes the two kids, goes to India, meets Mrs. Gabai, and says, I can't raise these kids. Which one do you want? And Mrs. Gabai said, oh, I'll take that one, which happened to have been Serena. And then he gets back on the boat and goes to Manila and gives up the other daughter to a friend or maybe somebody he knew through his merchant activities. And that's probably the last thing we know about Jacob Behlzar. So now Serena, this 8-year-old, is adopted by Mrs. Gabai. Mrs. Gabai is part of the Jewish community of India. She grows, she matures. They get her married to a gentleman named Alan and Amber. Aron Amber is also a merchant, but he's dealing in opium. Opium was a big crop in India, probably their major export crop, and the British Empire wanted to sell opium, export it, and as a result, a consequence, in 1848, there was the first opium war between England and China, One of the results of that war was that the southern ports of China were opened up to British shipping, including opium. When that war settled with a truce, that's how the British got Hong Kong. Part of the truce was giving England a 150-year lease on Hong Kong.
But opium was legal at that point in history.
Opium was legal.
Right.
People knew it was bad. Even but the Chinese had a big market, and even though the government, the imperial government, wasn't happy about people buying opium, if you got it there, you could sell it. And there are pictures of so-called opium dens where people would lay on opium beds and smoke opium. So Serena and Aron are married. He, being a merchant dealing with opium, finds out that there's a new British colony that opened up, the Straits Colony, which consisted of what is today Malaya and Penang and Singapore. So they were open for business, and since India was a British colony, Brits were free to move about the empire. So Aron and his wife, who had had 2 children in India, Joe Elias and I guess Ezra Elias, or no, there was a sister, Marion, moved to Singapore, where they continued their mercantile business, including the distribution of opium.
So sorry, they moved from Baghdad?
From Bombay. Or Calcutta.
Okay.
To Joe and Marion were born in Calcutta.
Okay.
They moved to Singapore. Singapore was just getting started. I think it had been established in 1836, so they were there like maybe 20 years later. As your mother used to say, them that gets there firstest gets the mostest. So they, made money selling opium. They invested in real estate, and they invested in an embryonic stock market. And then Alan Amber dies at a relatively young age, leaving his business activity to his oldest son, Joe. And it turns out that Joe was very adept at merchandising and dealing, wheeling and dealing, and was really the patriarch of the Amber family. The Amber family, apparently there was another Amber person in Singapore at the time who was sort of disreputable. So to distinguish them, they changed their name to Elias. And now Serena Amber is Serena Elias and Joe Elias. The family consisted of Joe, Ike, and Ezra, 3 brothers, and Miriam and Serena, 2 daughters, and they're growing up now and prospering in Singapore. I had mentioned that Mr. Behlzar, after he dropped off Serena with Mrs. Gabai, went on to Manila and dropped off the other daughter, Rosina. And these were like 8 or 10-year-old girls. The girls, one in Singapore and the other in Manila, communicated with each other all the time. Rosina got married. She married a gentleman who was a German tobacco farmer in the Philippines. They did fairly well, but Rosina died young. And so her sister, Serena, who was in Singapore, Serena Elias, took the children, the Grimberg children, and raised them in Singapore. And they became significant people within the Singapore community. So Serena, who would have been Anne's grandmother, is raising 2 families, her own and
Rosina's,
her sister's family. So Serena's children were Joe, Ike, Ezra, Miriam, and then Becky. Becky was the youngest child. They were devoutly Sephardic. Joe really ran the business well. Not only did he deal with opium, he opened up a tile factory. He was manufacturing tiles. He opened up the first cold storage plant in Singapore. He brought refrigeration to Singapore. When movies came about, he built and opened up a movie theater. So he was into a lot of stuff.
And quite successful.
And probably was one of the richest families in Singapore. So he was community-minded, he was wealthy, he was active. He built 4 homes, including a huge house on the east coast of Singapore called, in a suburb sort of called Katong. Anne often referred to the big house. So now let's talk about Anne's father's side, the Frankel side of the family.
Okay.
And now we have to scroll to a little village called Druskinikai in what is now Lithuania, but at that time was part of Russia. And similar to my family's story, this was an Orthodox Ashkenazi community struggling to make a living. Abraham Frankel, Anne's grandfather, had a sister and 2 brothers. And life was tough there, and they had pogroms. And now we're probably around the 1880s. Word gets out, presumably according to Anne's story, a resident of Druskinikai warned the Frankels that the Cossacks are preparing a riot, so people leave. The sister Marguerite marries a guy by the name of Morris Cohen and emigrates to America, the Boston area. A brother, Israel, gets his family, emigrates to Chicago. Another brother of Abraham Jacob emigrates to Peoria. Abraham, rather than emigrating to the United States, hears from a friend that gold was discovered in Borneo. Borneo is like the farthest place on earth from Druskinikai.
What country was Druskinikai in?
It was in the Pale of Settlement. It was in Russia at the time.
Russia.
Today it would be in Lithuania.
So then both your family and Mom's family, or Mom's paternal side of the family, immigrated from the same country.
Yeah, everyone who came from Eastern Europe. Poland wasn't a free country yet. Latvia, Lithuania, they were all occupied by the Russian Empire, and Jews in particular were restricted to living in those areas.
Okay.
So there weren't a lot of Jews living in St. Petersburg or Moscow. They were in what is now Ukraine, Latvia,
sure,
Lithuania, Estonia, Belarus. So here's Abraham. He's married to a woman, a distant cousin of his named Rosa, and they have 2 children, Marion and Julian. And the Cossacks are coming, so they're heading for Borneo. And there was no TWA or Pan Am getting from Druskinikai to Lithuania. It wasn't easy. They probably went on a sailing ship rather than even a steamship in those days.
And ironically, neither TWA nor Pan Am are existing airlines,
right,
but they were airlines.
Yeah.
So you could say Southwest and United,
right,
maybe.
So now they arrive in Borneo, and Rosa, who was certainly Orthodox, says, "Where's the rabbi? Where's the kosher butcher? Who are my son and daughter going to marry here? There are no Jewish people here in Borneo." So she essentially says, within a few days or weeks, "I'm out of here." And she goes back to Druskinikai with the 2 children.
On a ship.
Anne mentioned that Granny complained on the ship because she was kosher. She lived on tea and hardtack. Hardtack is like dog biscuits made out of compressed grain. But, no meat, no fish, no vegetables, nothing. So now Abe is looking for gold in Borneo, and his wife and 2 kids are back in Druskinikai. Well, it turns out he wasn't successful looking for gold in Borneo because there wasn't any. But he heard that there was tin being mined in Malaya. It was called Malaya in those days. It was part of the Straits Colony. So he moves to Malaya and works in a tin mine, maybe making $4 a week, but able to support himself and probably even save some money. And I think he was working maybe for even a couple of years, but of course he missed his wife and children. And a friend, again, he complained to someone in Malaya, and they said, "Well, why don't you go to Singapore? Because I think there's a rabbi and a synagogue in Singapore." So Abe leaves Malaya and goes to Singapore. Singapore is very close to Malaya. And sure enough, there is a rabbi. and there is a synagogue, and there is a cemetery, and a very small Jewish congregation, admittedly largely Sephardic, because it was settled sort of by Baghdadi Jews. And Abe meets the rabbi, talks to the rabbi writes a letter, probably in Hebrew, to either Rosa in Druskinikai or the rabbi in Druskinikai. And the rabbi in Druskinikai and talks to Rosa and said, you really should go back and be with your husband. Your place is with your husband. So she takes the two kids and gets on a ship. Transportation hadn't improved much by then, so it was a long and arduous journey, but she gets to Singapore. She meets the rabbi. There are some other Jews there. So now they decide to settle in Singapore. There was no mining in Singapore. She was a very good baker, so they opened up a store, a bakery on Victoria Street in Singapore. And now I'm talking like 1880, 1885. They lived above the store, and she was very good. I think that this was the first bakery in Singapore. It won awards as the best bakery in Singapore, and things are going okay. I would remind you that my grandfather, Tzemach, also had a bakery in Vilkamir. So there's that symmetry between Anne's forebears and mine.
Right. And one was in a log cabin and the other one was a storefront.
Exactly.
Got it.
Okay. Rosa becomes pregnant with David, Anne's father. So she sends Abe out to get some baby furniture, a bassinet, dresser, whatever. And I guess there are auctions, furniture auctions in Singapore. So Abe goes to this furniture auction, and indeed he gets a bassinet and some baby furniture, but there were such bargains that he bought, chairs and tables and lamps and other furniture, more than they needed or more than they could even fit upstairs in the apartment. So the furniture they didn't need, they put down in the bakery.
Sounds like going to Costco. You always come back with more than you need.
That's right. People would come into the bakery, buy bread or cakes. Oh, that's a lovely table. Would you like to buy it? And that was the beginning of A. Frankel and Company, the furniture business. So I don't know how long the bakery endured, but Abe opened up a furniture business, and again, because Singapore was growing and was very successful. So David grew up, and Abe also, he saved money, and he bought 100-acre coconut plantation in Singapore. He invested in the stock market. So he prospered too, and you could almost say that by the time David grew up, David Anne's father grew up, it was in a house of privilege. They were comfortable people. So now David is growing up, and I'm not sure David and Rebecca actually went to public schools. They may have been tutored privately, but they certainly didn't matriculate in Singapore public schools, if there were any. Okay, now it's getting time. In those days, people had arranged marriages. So, Becky is 18. It's time for her to get married.
Becky Anne's mother.
Yeah.
David Anne's father.
Yeah, but it's time for Becky to get married. So I guess Joe Elias had found out or had met a wealthy Sephardic Jew who lived in Brazil. And they arranged for this wealthy Brazilian guy to marry Becky. But by that time, Becky had met David. Don't ask me how they met. But they met and they fell in love. And I guess David proposed to her. And it was a scandal. Apparently Serena, Becky's mother, wasn't happy that her Sephardic daughter Becky was marrying this Ashkenazi young man. But love won out, and they married, and that's how they got together.
So both David and Becky came from fairly well-to-do families, but one was Ashkenazi, the other Sephardic.
Yeah, and both of whom sort of made their fortunes in Singapore around the 1860 to 1880. Those would have been, I guess, golden years. And if you had any kind of, moxie and verb, you could have made it very well in Singapore. And
one
they were
one
considered,
in furniture and one in opium.
And because they weren't Malays or they weren't Asians, they were considered as British subjects. So they were of the upper class just by their definition.
So now David and Becky are married, and they have some children.
They have some children.
Okay.
So David and Becky, their first child was Alan.
Alan Frankel.
Alan Frankel. 2 years later, I think, there was a Serena, Alan Anne's sister, Serena Frankel, was born. Anne was an accident. Anne came 8 years after Serena. So she was truly the baby. And I think Becky and David may have had a child in between, a boy named Philip who died, very young, who never made it. All of Anne and her siblings were all born in Singapore, as were Becky and David, both born in Singapore. On the Frankel side, the furniture of A. Frankel and Company prospered. Abe had this coconut plantation, and I think they later converted it to a rubber plantation. Choice real estate. Abe probably retired relatively young, in maybe the 20s or 1924, and either sold or gave the business to Julian and David, and it became known as Frankel Brothers Furniture. And Frankel Brothers Furniture was probably one of the preeminent furniture companies, specializing in, fine Southeast Asian woods and European stuff. I read an ad when they were going out of business in 1938, I believe, that it was almost like a Gump's place. They had furniture, they had crystal, they had silver, they had gifts, they had clothing. It was furniture and home furnishings.
Got it. So Frankel Brothers Furniture was formed by Abraham Frankel,
And then,
given to Julian and David, and then Julian and David ran it. Was it a manufacturer, or was it a importer?
I think it was import and export.
Okay, so they weren't making furniture, they were importing and then reselling.
Singapore at that time was probably more of a trading place than a manufacturing place, because it was strategically located to Java and India and China, and to this day, Singapore shares that thing. It's the gateway to Southeast Asia.
So this is sort of late 1930s. Were there any pieces of furniture that existed that from the Frankel Brothers Furniture that exist today?
There probably are in Singapore. I don't know. Okay, well, the Frankels had an elegant home. The Eliases had an elegant home. It would have been furnished with the finest of furniture, whether they got it from Frankel Brothers or not. Things sort of got interrupted in 1941 when World War II broke out. Now before we get to World War II, I think by 1938 the Frankels had done well enough that the Singapore Jewish community was changing. Jewish people were looking, where are we going to marry our sons and daughters? Where are we going to educate them? So they looked to Europe and the United States. So that, for example, Alan Frankel and Serena Frankel, when they went in their high school and probably primary schools, they were sent abroad to Switzerland and England. With Anne, she came much later, and her primary education was in Mrs. Snit or something, just a sort of private girls' school, where her class may have been 5 or 10 other girls, and a single teacher who would teach them to read and write in the British sonnets, and when they didn't know them properly, rap them on the hands with the fingers. It was...
With a ruler.
With a ruler, yeah. Yeah, it was a strict British upbringing, but it was a good one. So when the Frankels decided to emigrate voluntarily, they didn't know the war was coming, but they decided they wanted to move to the United States. They sold off the business, and Julian and David and their families came to San Francisco. I guess Julian and Anna opened up an antique store on Market Street. And David was sort of retired and dabbled around and stuff, and did okay because he had gotten his money out of Singapore, and the land and all that was still in Singapore. So he left all of his wealth behind, including their big house at 5 Marine Parade. It was probably furnished. They probably even maintained servants to maintain it. Well, in their, once they emigrated.
And I know in Singapore, when we went as a family in the mid-'70s, we saw streets with the family names on them. So they were very prominent.
When the Frankels left Singapore, it was still a sleepy country. It was still a British colony. It wasn't Singapore didn't become an independent country like until 1960. So it was still, very British, very traditional.
Mm-hmm.
So Anne, when Anne got to America, she got here in 1939. She was 10 years old. They enrolled her at Grant Public School. And the other thing I would point out is because the Frankels were, so affluent and so British, Anne was raised by an ama. An ama would be a Chinese nanny, so that Anne probably had a fairly lonely childhood. Mm-hmm. She'd get up in the morning and the ama would feed her and dress her and tie her shoes and make her breakfast. And she might not see her mother or father at all during the day. And then the ama would put her to bed at 8 o'clock at night, and mommy would come in and kiss her goodnight, and that was it. So when she got to America, there was no ama, and Anne was, this ama raised her from birth. Until age 10. And when Anne writes in her own articles that when they were going to move to America, Anne picked up a knife and wanted to kill herself because it meant losing her ama. And the family arranged, for the ama to go back. The ama had been married and had a son in Hong Kong, so the ama was taken care of. But Anne would have been devastated with losing her ama at age 10.
And yet she did. She came to the United States when she was 10 years old.
Right.
In 1939.
Yeah. And she mentions that one of the things that she was coming into Grant School at age 10, she wasn't an athlete and probably didn't even know how to tie her shoes because the ama did that for her. But academically, she was smarter than the kids, the regular kids in Grant School. So she had a good education, and one of the things she learned very quickly is that it's not too good to be too smart because people hate you.
Right, if you set the curve.
Yeah.
When the Frankels left Singapore, they left ahead of the war. They didn't know the war was coming, right, and the Japanese were going to invade Singapore. Yeah. But they left much of their wealth there.
Yeah.
And then moved to San Francisco, and what had been a very opulent lifestyle became a middle-class lifestyle.
Well, I think when they came to America, even though they had properties, including this 100-acre plantation, in Singapore, they were still getting, money from selling the coconuts or the rubber. So they were well off when they first came to America. But then in 1942, when the Japanese invaded Singapore and conquered it, all of that was lost. The Japanese occupied their houses. The entire family on the Frankel side had already the Frankel side. David and Becky and their family came to America in 1939. Actually, Abraham had died, but Rosa Frankel, along with Julian and Anna Frankel, stayed behind in Singapore. And when the Japanese invaded Singapore, everyone on the Elias family and the Frankel family were able to get out. So Joe, Ike, and Ezra, the Eliases, spent the war in India. Rosa, Julian, and Anna got the last boat out of Singapore, got to India. Around India, a different boat to New York, came across the country, and Julian, Anna, and their mother Rosa settled in San Francisco. So they would have been war refugees from Singapore.
And this was after David and Becky and Anne and that family moved to Singapore?
Yeah.
Or before?
That was after. I mean, David and Becky got here in 1939. Singapore didn't fall until 1942.
So somewhere between 1939 and 1942 is when Rosa and Julian...
Yeah, they got out on the last ship. You can almost pinpoint it to the day, and I think we even have a newspaper article where she was interviewed by the San Francisco Chronicle, and when they left Singapore, they were followed by Japanese submarines. It wasn't a first-class trip.
Yeah.
But they were lucky to have survived. But now, all of the wealth in terms of real estate and tile factories are left behind in Singapore under control of the Japanese.
Mm-hmm. But the Japanese occupation lasted 3 years.
The war ended in 1945.
So from 1942 to 1945 it was occupied.
Yes. And after the war, after the atomic bomb was dropped, members of the family went back to Singapore to recover their properties. And their homes and real estate was still there, but much of the furniture and stuff like that was taken by the Japanese. Mm-hmm. But the British government did a very good job of recovering it, and I think, Charlie Ginsberg went back with Ned Klumek and with the British authorities, and they went into some of these homes, and they, that bureau was taken from my house. You get it back. That dining table came from my house. So they recovered some of their stuff, but not all of it. Mm-hmm. But certainly the properties, the Pavilion Theater, and the coconut/rubber plantation was still there. So now it's the end of the war, both the Frankels and the Eliases have recovered their properties. But now the world is changing. Communism is on the march. There were concerns, in French Indochina became Vietnam, and the British colonies in general, British and French colonies in Asia were falling apart. Communism was on the march. So I think the Frankels and the Eliases took that to heart and said, we better, get out of here and get whatever we can for our properties before the country goes communist.
Mm-hmm.
So they sold their real estate holdings and their homes and everything, and tile factories and cold storage facilities and movie theaters.
Right, all their assets.
They sold all their assets to Chinese merchants who were fairly wily, and for pennies on the dollar.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately they got some of that back. As it turned out, Singapore didn't go communist. It became vigorously capitalistic. Their properties, the 100-acre coconut plantation was sold to a developer, and it was called Frankel Estates, because it was the Frankel plantation. And as you saw in 1977, we walked on Frankel Avenue and Frankel Boulevard. The old Uncle Joe's big house was on Amber Road, a private road. All of that was sold off, and it was subsequently redeveloped. When we were there in 1977 as a family, where Anne's home had been, that was the parking lot of a department store.
Right, because a lot of land in Singapore was reclaimed.
A lot of Singapore is an island, so a lot of the land is fill. So you scrape off the top of a mountain and dump it into the ocean, and you've got another mile of city.
Right. Yeah.
So that both of the big house, the big Elias house on Amber Road, and is long gone, and the Frankel house is long gone.
Now let's move to, we've talked about Singapore and sort of where the Frankels and Eliases came from. Now we're the Frankel family, Becky and David, Alan, Serena, and Anne. And Anne grew up essentially from age 10 until whatever in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And stayed in California and never really went back, and met Mr. Potato.
That's right, Sweet Potato.
Mr. Sweet Potato.
Yeah, they, and I guess she, after grad school, she went to Lowell High School and, did well. She got a merit award for being on the badminton team.
Okay.
I think for a period of time, she went to Mills College because I think her parents had gone on a trip to Europe and they didn't know what to do with that. So she went to Mills College. But after that, she went to Berkeley and got a bachelor's degree in Berkeley, got some jobs in social work, went back to Berkeley and got a master's in MSW, Masters of Social Work, from Berkeley.
Mm-hmm.
And that's and I met her not as the girl in the goldfish, not the girl in the goldfish bowl, but a kind of mundane social worker.
I'm sure a very good social
A
worker.
very good one, dealing mainly with children.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Alan married Barbara, and they lived in Berkeley. David set Alan up in the toy business, a toy store on Post Street called the Ambers.
Yeah.
And it did okay, but then when things like Toys R Us came in, and Gemco and all of these big box people, Alan couldn't compete.
Mm-hmm.
So he spent the rest of his life pretty much as a manufacturer's representative for toy companies.
And Anne's sister, Serena.
Anne's sister, Serena, met Irving Rosenblatt. Irving Rosenblatt came from a prominent family, prominent in two regards. Irving's father was a gentleman by the name of Rosenblatt, who made a lot of money as a wine distributor, not growing wine, but distributing it. And Irving's mother, May, was a Newman. If you drive down Highway 5, you come to the town of Newman, and surrounding that is a big ranch, an agricultural ranch. That's the Newman family.
Mm-hmm.
So, Serena got her dream of marrying a rich guy who could maintain her properly. They had a couple of sons, Gary and Trigg. Irving was a prominent attorney, a Harvard-educated attorney, but law was almost an avocation. I think managing the Newman Ranch was his primary activity.
And what was the relationship like between Anne as the baby and Serena and Alan?
Well, I think because of the age difference, when Anne was 2, Alan was 10. So I don't think Alan and Serena probably went to Anne's birthday parties, but thereafter they didn't have much to do with them. And then during grammar school years, Anne and Serena and Alan were abroad.
In boarding school.
In boarding school. So that's why I say Anne probably had a fairly lonely childhood.
Right, because she was 8 years younger than her sister.
Yeah, her friends would have been, again, proper British colonials. They wouldn't have been, Anne wouldn't have been mingling with the Chinese or the Malays or the Indians.
Yeah. And then Anne eventually moved out of David and Becky's house, got an apartment in San Francisco.
Yeah, that in itself was scandalous because, in those days the proper thing is children lived at home until they got married, and if a daughter moved out or if a son moved out, other than going to a school or a university, the family was falling apart. I'm sure people asked Becky, how come Anne doesn't live with you anymore?
Mm-hmm.
Anne just wanted her own space.
Okay. And then we get to the point where you and Anne meet, and we've talked about how you met.
And we talked about the wedding.
We talked about the wedding.
And the honeymoon.
And the honeymoon.
Okay.
And now you and Anne get married.
We get married. Initially, we lived at my tiny duplex apartment at 1721 Delaware Street in Berkeley, and then about a month later we moved to Park Hills in the Berkeley Hills.
You rented a house there?
We rented a house from my friend Ed Smutney, which was I think a 2-bedroom, 2-bath home with a very nice backyard. The weather was, it was a block off Grizzly Peak, but it was on the Tilden side of Grizzly Peak in a little valley, and the weather was just horrible. In the summer, I'd get up and it was foggy. I couldn't find my way out of the development. Drive through the gate at Park Hills, turn right, go down 1 block, and the sun is shining.